Hello, Internet. It's time for another rant. Today, I'd like to talk about the Electoral College. Now, I know there are already plenty of videos talking about the subject, but I still feel the need to rant a little bit. I think the thing that's been driving me the most crazy are people who are talking about abolishing the Electoral College, and they seem to imply, maybe not explicitly state, but imply that our founding fathers were too stupid to think of the idea of electing our president through the popular vote alone. Are you kidding me? The idea of democracy has been around for thousands of years, and the founding fathers obviously were very well versed in all of the different kinds of government they could have. Now, when we're talking about the Electoral College, of course, that is based on the Congress. So some of the things I talk about might be more directed to the Congress than the Electoral College, but the principle is the same. When the founding fathers were getting together, they came up with this brilliant compromise that resulted in Congress being the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the Electoral College being a mix of different kinds of representation. Now, when we use the word compromise, that implies that there were at least two other options available before the compromise was made. One of those options is really obvious. Let's just have the president be based on the popular vote, or something similar to that. But what was the other option? What was the other extreme that was rejected? Well, perhaps it's obvious, but that answer is have every state have one vote. Now, at first, that might not seem to make sense to a lot of people. But if you really think about it, it does make sense, and it's in line with other organizations. See, it all depends on how you look at the individual states and the role of the federal government in relationship to those states. Where is another place where this happens? Well, the perfect example is the United Nations. In the United Nations, China gets one vote. The United States gets one vote. I know I'm simplifying things, but how is that fair? China has a much bigger population than the United States. Shouldn't China have much more representation in the United Nations than the United States does? Well, I'm sure some people believe that they should, but that would be a really stupid move for a couple of reasons. First of all, the needs of China, the culture of China, everything about China is significantly different than the United States. So while the number of people in China might be much greater, the needs of those who are in China, the morals of those who are in China, the ideology of those who are in China, are a little bit more similar to each other, whereas the people in the United States have similar needs, similar morality, similar values. And so rather than saying that we're going to have representation of the people, we're really representing communities. We have representation from what it means to be a United States citizen. What does it mean to be a citizen of China? And those need to be equally balanced. Because if you allow China to have proportional representation to its entire population, the needs of the United States are going to get buried, ignored completely often in that situation. The same thing can happen with states. You know, a community in the state of Wyoming, I know I keep using the same states over and over again, but the needs of those in Wyoming could be very different than the needs of those in California. Should the fact that California has a greater population mean that the needs of Wyoming are completely ignored? Some of the examples that I would like to give here, let's just look at Salt Lake City, Utah, where I'm from. In Salt Lake, we have snow that comes about every year. And the government is responsible for removing the snow from our freeways, from our roads, from our sidewalks. We have to come up with laws and funding for all of that. Now, if we have a government at a national level that takes care of everything, and let's just pretend for a minute that we're just in the western side of the United States, if Los Angeles is completely in control of the government, how many people in Los Angeles care about snow removal? Care about the safety of the roads after a big snowstorm? Probably not many. It's a need that they've never even considered before. Now, of course, if they're from somewhere else that they've experienced snow, that might be different. But the vast majority of the community of Los Angeles is going to have very different needs to the community of Salt Lake City. Or let's compare a couple other states. What about New York? They experience snow, they experience cold weather. But even New York might not understand the needs of someone who comes from, say, Minnesota in terms of heating. Lack of heat in New York can have dire consequences, but it's nothing compared to what it would be like to have lack of heat in Minnesota. So you see, in order for every single community to have their needs represented and at least talked about, they need to have a higher proportion of representation than their population might suggest normally. And so, of course, our founding fathers came up with this brilliant compromise. Let's give states that have more population more representation, but let's make sure that those communities that have smaller representation are still represented and still have a voice in the process. It's not a perfect situation, but it's something. Why does this matter? People are talking about demolishing the Electoral College. Well, if that's the case, there's not just one option on the table. Demolishing the Electoral College doesn't mean we just default to going to the popular vote. It could also mean that we go to the other side of the compromise. Maybe it's time we go back to one state, one vote, and stop allowing those states that have higher populations to dominate the needs of every other state in the union. And you might say, well, we're not going to allow that. We're going to have a vote, or whatever the case may be. But keep in mind, why on earth should the states in the middle of the country that happen to have smaller populations allow their entire lives to be decided by a few people in Los Angeles and New York City? Because basically that's what it comes down to. And more importantly, even though this isn't the direct response, it's an indirect response to the Electoral College, this is about people who live in big cities dominating people who live in rural areas. People who live in rural areas don't understand all of the problems and needs that are in big cities. But people in big cities also do not understand many of the needs of people who live in rural areas. It's not a big deal if we continue to talk to each other, if we continue to respect each other, if we can continue to allow people who are in rural areas to have a certain amount of control of their own communities. But in a world where everything is dictated by the national government to every single individual community, we could have a civil war on our hands like nobody's ever seen before. Or be careful what you wish for. Maybe we'll just go back to one vote, one state. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day.